afternoon, I'm Gentry D. Winter, and thank you for tuning in to Rebel Girls, the show where I'll introduce you to women throughout our world history that have fought to break down sexism within the music scene. In the last episode, we chatted about some very powerful, confident, and sometimes sassy women from the 13th century all the way back to 810. This week, we will be focusing on the 1800s, beginning with Clara Schumann. Clara lived from 1819 to 1896 in Germany and was regarded as one of the most distinguished pianists of the Romantic era. The reason there is such a large gap in the timeline is that there were a lot of societal pressures against women composers throughout history. As Clara explained, I once believed that I had creative talent, but I had given up on this idea. A woman must not wish to compose. There never was one able to do it. Clara said later in her life, "Am I to be the one? It would be arrogant to believe that." But it turns out that she was right. Clara was a child prodigy. Her father had planned her career and life down to the smallest detail, which started with piano lessons at the age of 4. She began touring at the age of 9, and by the time she was 18, Clara performed a series of sold-out recitals in Vienna. The Romantic era began in the late 18th century when composers explored writing music that was more individualistic, emotional, and dramatic. This new genre of music was often inspired by non-musical stimuli like nature, literature, poetry, or the plastic arts. During her 61-year career as a concert pianist, Clara had managed to change the entire format of piano recitals from displays of art to programs of serious works. She also normalized playing from memory and was an influential teacher to many young pianists. Like Clara, our next leading woman in music, Ethel Smyth, also faced challenges with being a female composer. Ethel tended to be marginalized because she was a woman, and her music was criticized for not measuring up to the standard of her male competitors. Some of her works included the Concerto for Violin, Horn, and Orchestra, the Mass in D, and her opera The Wreckers, which was considered by critics to be the most important English opera composed during the period between Purcell and Britten. Another one of her operas, Der Wald, was, for more than a century, the only opera by a woman composer ever produced at New York's Metropolitan Opera. But the main reason I included Ethel Smyth in my list of influential women in music is because of her involvement in the women's suffrage movement. In 1910, Ethel gave up music for 2 years in order to devote herself to the cause of the Women's Social and Political Union. Her composition, The March of the Women, even became the anthem of the women's suffrage movement. In 1912, Ethel was arrested for throwing stones at misogynistic politicians' houses along with 109 other members of the Women's Social and Political Union. When one of Ethel's friends went to visit her at the Holloway prison, he found suffragettes marching and singing as Ethel leaned out of her window conducting the song with a toothbrush. Ethel documented her experience in jail in her book Female Pipings in Eden. She said she was in good company of united women, Old, young, rich, poor, strong, delicate, and that they were all putting the idea they were imprisoned for before their personal needs. Not only was Ethel Smith a strong leader of the women's suffrage movement, but she also had a hand in changing the way women were regarded when it came to composing music. In recognition of her work as a composer and writer, Ethel was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 1922, becoming the first female composer to be awarded a damehood. You go, girl. Our next influential woman in music, Florence Price, who was noted as the very first African-American woman to be recognized as a symphonic composer, as well as the very first to have one of her compositions played by a major orchestra. Florence lived from 1887 to 1953 and was born in Arkansas. Her family was well respected in her community despite the racial issues and stereotypes present during this time. Her mother was a music teacher who guided Florence's early musical training and encouraged her to take piano lessons. You could say Florence was a child prodigy because she played her first piano performance at the young age of 4 and had her first composition published at the age of 11. Florence's love of music led her to become the head of the music department at Clark Atlanta University in 1910. This university is now classified as a historically black college, which means it was established before the Civil Rights Act of 1964, with the sole intention of being a higher education institution primarily that serves the African American community. It's quite significant that Florence could be a part of the Clark Atlanta University during this time because the segregation in the United States resulted in the majority of higher education institutions being predominantly white, as well as completely disqualifying African American student enrollment. There was a strong racial prejudice towards African Americans, leading her to make the sad decision to identify as Mexican in order to avoid discrimination. After a series of racial incidents in her hometown, particularly the lynching of an African American man in 1927, Florence's family decided to leave Arkansas. And, like many African American families living in the Deep South during this time, they decided to move north in the Great Migration in efforts to escape Jim Crow conditions. Florence thrived while living in Chicago. She enrolled at various universities like the Chicago Musical College, the Chicago Teachers College, and the University of Chicago, where she studied languages and liberal arts studies as well as music. During this time, she composed some of her most popular works like Three Little Negro Dances, Songs to a Dark Virgin, and Moon Bridge. Even though Florence's musical training was influenced by European traditions, her music style evolved to incorporate African American melodies and rhythms. Her music developed as she began to add African American spirituals, emphasizing the rhythm and syncopation of the religious songs rather than just using the text. Florence's melodies were mostly blues-inspired but mixed with the more traditional European romantic techniques she had learned as a child. She wrote with a vernacular style, using sounds and ideas that fit the reality of urban society. Her ability to weave tradition and modernism in her music was extraordinary and reflected the way life was for African Americans in large cities at the time. Florence Price was an exceptional composer, combining different music techniques to create a sound that had never been heard before. She used her rocky past to propel her into a successful musical career. And because the Chicago Symphony Orchestra premiered her composition on June 15, 1933, she will live on in the history of music as the first ever African American woman to have her piece played by a major orchestra. And on to our final influential woman of this episode, one who, like Florence Price, was a substantial African American music writer. Sister Rosetta Tharpe lived from 1915 to 1973 and was a singer, songwriter, guitarist, and recording artist. It is said that Rosetta influenced early rock and roll musicians like Johnny Cash, Little Richard, and even Elvis Presley.
Evil thoughts do bite. Oh, if you leave me, I will die.
Like Florence Price, Rosetta was encouraged by her mother to begin singing and playing the guitar. She too was cited as a young musical prodigy. Rosetta began singing gospel at her church, where her mother was the preacher and grew up with a strong religious background. This religious upbringing influenced Rosetta to push spiritual music into the mainstream by pioneering the rise of pop gospel. The first song she wrote in this genre was Rock Me, where she used heavy distortion on her electric guitar, igniting the rise of electric blues. This song, along with That's All, My Man and I, and The Lonesome Road, were all instant hits, establishing Rosetta as an overnight sensation and one of the first commercially successful gospel recording artists. Her recordings caused an immediate controversy, as some conservative churchgoers were offended that Rosetta had ventured into the world of pop music. But, as some were shocked by her new music, many more loved the mixture of gospel-based lyrics with secular-sounding blues music. Unfortunately, as Rosetta grew more famous for her unique melodies, she began to fall out of favor of the gospel community. The conservative religious circles frowned upon Rosetta playing the guitar in settings like secular nightclubs and alongside blues and jazz musicians. But the thoughts and opinions of others were not going to crush Rosetta's spirit. Not only was Rosetta facing criticism from conservative church groups and the gospel community, but she was also facing harsh gender stereotypes. During this time, masculinity was directly linked to guitar skills, and because she played the electric guitar for all of her performances, she often received the backhanded compliment that she could play like a man. But Rosetta had substantial confidence in herself and continued to do the things she loved most. She toured through the 1940s with various gospel quartets, one of which was the Dixie Hummingbirds. And in 1949, to commemorate Rosetta's first anniversary of being a homeowner in Richmond, Virginia, she put on a concert at the Altria Theater. Supporting her for that concert were the Twilight Singers, whom Rosetta adopted as her new background singers, renaming them the Rosettes.
I see trouble in the air. I see trouble in the air. Up above my head. Up above my head. I see trouble in the air. I see trouble in the air.
Rosetta's unique guitar style, a melody-driven urban blues with traditional folk influence, was a huge inspiration to and precursor of rock and roll. Many renowned rock and roll artists like Little Richard and Johnny Cash admitted that Rosetta was their favorite singer growing up. Including Aretha Franklin, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Isaac Hayes, many other musicians identified her singing, guitar playing, and showmanship as a crucial influence on them. In 2011, BBC4 aired a one-hour documentary titled Sister Rosetta Tharpe, the Godmother of Rock and Roll, revealing the true power this one woman had on the most influential music genres ever. And on December 13, 2017, Rosetta was elected to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as an early influence.
I really do believe there's a heaven somewhere.
Clara Schumann, Ethel Smith, Florence Price, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe all infused different features into their music. From finding inspiration from non-musical sources like nature, literature, and poetry, to writing with a vernacular style that reflected the life of urban society, these 4 women shaped music into what they truly wanted it to be. Because of these women, musicians today aren't afraid to break boundaries and try something new. Tune in next week for my final episode where we will delve into the 1900s with Delia Derbyshire, Carole King, Aretha Franklin, Patti Smith, and Bjork. I'm Gentry DeWinter, signing off.
You believe there is a heaven somewhere, heaven somewhere.